everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. So people at the Stoa know that understanding the culture war has been a theme here. And from 2016 onward, I think the collective intensity seems to be ratcheting up. And especially with the last 2 years during the pandemic, it seemed extra intense. And now that there's a moment where we can focus, or it seems like the culture war is focusing away from COVID, I thought it might be a good time to talk about what happened. And it felt right to invite a medically diverse panel coming from different perspectives to have a conversation about it. And today's session is titled Truth, Trust, and Culture War, because there seems to be something about truth and trust that felt pretty salient and revealing during the last 2 years during the COVID culture war. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And we have 4 people on our panel, and I'll introduce them now. Zubin Damania, aka ZDoggMD, and he's the healthcare's unfiltered voice, a physician who is a part of the Health 3.0 movement, who is advocating for an alt-middle approach to all things culture war during COVID. And this is ZDogg's first time at the Stoa, so it's really good to have him here with us. Next, we have Chris Kavanagh returning to the Stoa. Chris is a cognitive anthropologist and social psychologist who co-hosts the popular Decoding the Gurus podcast that critiques what they call secular gurus that are active in the culture war. And Ben Burgis is the 3rd time at the Stoa, I believe, the logician of the left. And Ben is a philosophy professor, host of Give Them an Argument podcast, and has written a lot of great books, including his new one on Christopher Hitchens, What He Got Right, How He Went Wrong, and Why He Still Matters. And lastly, our good friend, David Fuller, a journalist who worked for Channel 4 and BBC, and who's founded Rebel Wisdom, a channel that probably has the best meta perspective on the culture war. So this is going to be a delicious panel. I have no idea how the conversation goes. It could be super awkward or super delicious. We'll find out. And so I'll explain how today's going to work. But if everyone besides the panelists can turn off their camera, that will help the recording just pick up their faces. And the question they are going to be cohering around is this one right here. What did you learn about truth and trust from the last 2 years of witnessing the culture war during our pandemic? And then the order of the panelists will be Zubin first, then Chris, then Ben, then David. So Zubin after your share for about roughly 5 minutes, and then Zubin just taking Chris, and Chris, Ben, and then Ben, David. And then David will, after his share, just open up the space for about a 45-minute exchange. And then we'll pivot to Q&A for about 30 minutes. So we're here for 90 minutes in total. Pop your question in the chat anytime. I'll call on you. You can ask your question to the panelists. If you don't want to be on YouTube, just indicate that, and I will read your question on your behalf. So that being said, let me give access to everyone. ZDogg, you are up, my friend, and welcome to the Stoa. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you, P. Diddy. Can you hear me? Sweet. This is a real joy. I really have learned a lot about culture war from actually reading the Stoa. For me, it was an interesting thing because, I was a Stanford physician for about 10 years, hospital medicine, internal medicine, and then started making videos, putting them on YouTube and trying to create this educational platform and this connection platform. What Chris would probably call, a guru platform in the end. And as it grew, we had more and more influence. Then comes the COVID thing. And I was quite conditioned by the medical system to think, okay, the CDC is the gold standard for understanding truth, what is, and also understanding, because they specialize in this, what are the best protocols and procedures in place to manage something like a pandemic. So in the early days, was really relying on them because they'd actually done very good work prior to that. And what shocked me, what I learned during the unfolding of the pandemic is that, wow, this culture war idea, the fragmentation crisis where we don't even know what is, let alone what ought to be, all the things that have been discussed, came to a head. They were accelerated and catalyzed by this global phenomenon that mixed, okay, what's true in terms of science, but then what ought to be true in terms of our values and our policies. And because we have this accelerating social media fragmentation and these mimetic tribes and this idea of these almost group minds emerging that are kind of actualized by individual neurons, which are us using like, dislike, and share as our neurotransmitters, suddenly there's a fracturing of what is. We don't even know what is actually true. Is this thing harming kids or not? Do masks work or not? Do the vaccines cause, all these infertility and all these other things or not? And depending on what your tribe you're in, the values of that tribe are, that mimetic sort of fragment, you're going to see everything through that lens. And the concept of trust now becomes, well, I'm only going to trust people that actually are in group in that tribe. Otherwise, it just doesn't make sense. In fact, I will get so much back pressure on me to conform with that tribe that it's almost dangerous for me reputationally to violate it. And this is what I saw in medicine. So if you were not in the, what Peter has called the COVIDian tribe of like, listen, we got to mask infants from birth, vaccinate everyone with the number of boosters is basically the number you've gotten plus one more at least is the number you need, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, lockdowns, all of that. You're heretical to that tribe, and you're promoting disinformation, and you're likely to be censored by one of the big tech companies, et cetera. On the other side of it, the antithesis or COVIDiate side is the opposite. Like, well, no, we're going to minimize the dangers of this thing. And to the point where more conservatives in the United States die of COVID than liberals. So there's actually a disparity there. But at the same time, there's a lot of, reality in that sphere of like, guys, like, even having a heterodox idea about the science on this is something that'll get you completely deleted from one of the extreme tribes. So the thing that I learned at the end of this is that, wow, we really need this kind of corpus callosum, these fibers that connect these disparate minds and can make some sense by understanding each of the minds and trying to speak in a way that is looking for synthesis. And it's been extremely hard to find and to do, but the pandemic has given us an opportunity to see that as an existential need.
Awesome. Chris, I think you're up next.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, as the case may be. So I guess probably I took a little bit of a different lesson about truth and trust than what Zubin just outlined. And in some sense, I would agree, it confirmed something that I already expected, which is institutions are not perfect. Public health messaging often involves compromises between competing positions and sometimes political incentives going in. Governments will take various positions on issues. I'm in Japan. There's still nobody allowed in the country except tourist visas are not allowed, but students are now allowed back in. And scientists can have reasonable disagreement about controversial topics, and including public health measures. So those things were kind of priced into my equation for how things would be dealt with in a pandemic or some global health crisis. Now, I've never experienced one of them in my lifetime, except for, SARS, and that was obviously very different than now. So there were lots of things that were interesting to see about that, how that played out. But the thing that struck me probably most strongly was how evoking an anti-institutional sentiment or anti-establishment pose was basically a cheat code to attention. And the thing that sort of surprised me a little bit about that is that during a global pandemic, which almost everybody in the reasonable sphere can recognize resulted in over 1 million deaths worldwide and has had various serious effects on people's health in most countries, and that anti-establishment sentiment and partisan politics is so strong that those facts kind of didn't have a massive impact on the ability for people to deny the impact, and actually led to a resurgence of anti-vaccine, anti-public health sentiment. So that was probably a surprise to me. But over the course of the pandemic, I've spent more time looking at what happened in response to previous pandemics and various efforts to do national vaccines or global vaccine efforts. And in all cases, there's been a strong reaction against them. So I guess I probably was naive in anticipating that this would be different. Another point would be that the vaccine and anti-vaccine and conspiracy ecosystems are vibrant and flourishing. I already knew that because I had a personal interest, but I was quite surprised at how they were able to capture more mainstream attention than they had before. That had already started to happen in the kind of Trump era, and with and we could discuss that about the influence of politics on that. But basically, Andrew Wakefield was a figure that was on the fringe and wouldn't be invited on the mainstream news to discuss things. He wouldn't likely appear on Joe Rogan, but Brett Weinstein, Pierre Corey, Robert Malone, and Peter McCulloch, an entire new wave, all broke through and were given mainstream attention, especially on right-wing media. So I guess my message about truth and trust is that there are very real issues and limitations with mainstream institutions and mainstream media and news sources, but often those issues result in people ignoring huge problems in alternative ecosystems. And I think it's important that we extend like a critical sentiment across all of the ecosystems we include. And I guess the last thing, just before handing over to Ben, is that despite disagreements and emphasis that we might all have on the panel, I think we probably do all agree that it's semi-miraculous that there were effective vaccines produced so quickly that work extremely well and are extremely safe, and that COVID is more dangerous than the vaccines, including to children. And so while we can debate things about masking rules, school openings, the necessity or efficacy of booster shots, or recommendations about travel and whatnot, I think these are all things that we can have reasonable disagreement and discuss the feelings of the mainstream institution, but we should be able to agree on the kind of core, I think, which is sometimes overlooked when people are talking about the failures of the mainstream. Ben.
Yeah, that was all really good. I guess so. All right, truth and trust. I think I'm too much of a philosophy nerd to let that go by without saying that, truth is not an epistemic concept, right? It has nothing to do, like what's true and what we know is true are two separate questions, right? So if I say that, Alexander the Great's paternal grandfather's maternal grandmother, had a splinter in the big toe on her right foot when she was 6 years old, that's either true or false, but short of inventing a time machine, we're not going to find out which one. So, but trustworthiness, right? I think that's the real issue. And on trustworthiness, I guess a couple of thoughts, and in particular about the culture war framing. So I do think, I do start from the general, just to lay my cards on the table. I think I have, more or less the COVID views you'd expect me to have. I'm triple vaccinated. I'll be quadruple vaccinated as soon as as soon as they tell people in my age category to do so. And if I end up having to go back and get another shot once a year, like the flu shot, I don't actually view that as a very big deal, right? I think that's a very small trade for not having to re-engage the kind of extreme public health measures that had to happen in the past. But one thing that does hit me looking back on this is that I think that, when you look at sort of loss of public trust in institutions, when you look at the popularity of conspiracy theories, even if you think the sort of primary onus for that is on, people spreading conspiracy theories, which, fair enough. I think there's a lot of blame to go around, actually. I think that there's a lot that happened with public institutions, health officials, et cetera, that look to me like own goals, right? The places where public trust was undermined, not by something that was happening from outside, but by very short-sighted decisions that were being made from inside. So, just quick examples of what I'm talking about. I mean, the one that still stands out to me as obvious is that the initial public health advice to not wear masks, followed up by the 180 on that, which really, I think the more you look at that, I mean, it's not like there was some amazing new scientific discovery that they'd just gotten a bunch of new data in about how effective masks were. In fact, it was more or less admitted that was a decision to sort of conserve the mask supply, which, even if you think that's justified, I think when you do things like that, it's you're just going to lose a certain amount of trust. I think that there are other examples that we can talk about that were fairly political decisions by at least some public health experts that that I think also reinforced the problem. And so that's one thing. I mean, I think if you're going to learn from this experience, I think there are things about accountability of public health experts and institutions that do need to be learned there. But then the other, and the one that's unfortunately harder to solve, is that I think that a lot of this also has to do with the sort of bad epistemic consequences of media fragmentation. That given the economic collapse of traditional media, and the way that you have have this sort of strange situation where there are many, many, many different sources of media that all have their own little audiences, some much larger than others, but all some tiny fraction of the audience that would like watch Walter Cronkite talk about Vietnam or whatever. That means that that you have a lot of bad incentives to pander to whatever audience you have left, to not correct yourself when correcting yourself would feed into some other narrative. And I think those are generally pretty distributed, right? So, I mean, I think if you look at something like the ivermectin, controversy, where on the one hand, it really is true that a lot of what was going around various mainstream, and progressive media spaces about how, it's just for horses and et cetera, is just like factually not true, and importantly not true. And anybody who knew that would no longer trust anything they heard from people who said that. But it was still true that there was never any serious evidence that it was actually helpful with COVID. And that point, ends up getting lost. Again, it seems kind of like an own goal to me. And finally, I mean, I guess my last thought, and this is the part that's actually the hardest to do anything about. I don't have a lot of brilliant solutions in my back pocket here. Is just that I think I think the fact that if anything should be just a technocratic sort of public health issue that like has nothing to do with politics, it should be what you do to what the guidance is for what you should do to protect yourself during a pandemic. Whether you should wear a mask, whether you should get a vaccine, et cetera. And the fact that all this stuff just got sucked into the culture war in this really remarkable way, right? Like, and I remain, I guess it's unknowable, but my strong suspicion is that if Donald Trump had come out very hard, very early on for super strict policies that everybody had to be masked all times, we should have really strict lockdowns, et cetera, then there would be millions of people who are currently adamant anti-maskers who would be wearing their MAGA masks everywhere. And there would probably be more liberal anti-maskers also. And so I think that that's a depressing symptom of a much larger and more sort of general phenomena, which is that we live in a world where, from my perspective, a lot of the most important political issues, ones about, for example, the distribution of wealth and economic power, are sort of off the map, right? They're not really considered, but everything else, right? From the pettiest imaginable cultural issues about, Disney announcing that they're going to recast the lead in some movie to what should be sort of neutral technocratic issues about public health, everything else immediately becomes political. And we end up getting polarized in what I think are very unhelpful ways. Polarization can be good if it depended on the results, but I think we end up getting a very unhelpful form of polarization, which is a depressing place to land at the end of this, because I think it's sort of easy to diagnose the problem and very hard to cure it.
Awesome. Yeah, some really great contributions already. For me, I mean, I guess we are focusing mainly on COVID and the effects of the pandemic. And for me, as a lot of people have said already, it was sort of an accelerator and a catalyst of what was already there. This sense of kind of fragmentation that predated it. And then I remember there was this kind of sense, maybe at the beginning of the pandemic, that, oh, this might bring us together. This might be the end of I think it lasted about 2 minutes, but there was a sense that maybe something like this might kind of transcend the party political differences. And it was absolutely fascinating, particularly to watch from the UK, because I've become increasingly aware of the difference in the media landscape. We're all kind of exposed to the American culture war landscape because of social media. I think that's been a kind of unexpected consequence of the kind of globalization of the conversation through social media, is how much, certainly in the UK, we kind of always used to see ourselves as slightly above the culture war dynamic. We kind of looked at you guys pulling yourselves apart over things like abortion and thought, this is crazy, look at them. But actually now we're very much in it. Like the trans conversation is just as heated over in the UK. I think it's got a slightly different characteristic. But I do think that we never had a political conversation around masks, for example. It never got quite as polarized as it did in the States. And I feel that's partly because we've got a slightly healthier media culture. We've got the BBC, which acts as a kind of sheet anchor in the middle that means that it's not all corporate. It's not everyone following the kind of lowest common denominator of feeding their base. But that kind of sense of fragmentation, like every single topic you can imagine gets pulled into this division that is perfectly calculated to create as close as 50-50 splits as possible around any particular topic. And that's kind of the kind of generator function of polarization, I think, for everyone who was really paying attention, became really, really clear during the pandemic. You just saw just so clearly the kind of dynamics that were playing out, and this sense of fragmentation that many of you have already talked about just became completely clear. And so we all know about the kind of epistemic bubbles, the filter bubbles. Something I've coined in the past is the idea of the uncanny valley between the mainstream and the alternative. So legacy media, and I frame it as we've lost any truth seeking on both sides, because the mainstream, I think, and this I include the authorities in this, is that I feel that a lot of the time they are communicating in really broad strokes in a way that was suitable for the pre-internet days, when I think like public health messaging has to kind of be a lot more complex. It has to understand, it has to stop treating people as idiots. And I think a lot of people were reacting to the sense that they were being told, like they weren't, there were sort of broad brush, low resolution messages that were being conveyed. And then a lot of the analysis that was then finding traction was people finding holes in those messages. And so I think a lot of for me, like conspiracy theory tends to thrive in the gaps left by the mainstream narratives. And so there's a sort of talking down to people that I think fed a lot of the conspiracy narratives. And this uncanny valley means that because the mainstream legacy won't platform certain figures, you don't get the interrogation of truth that you do so you get this kind of thriving of some extreme people, like you mentioned kind of Robert Malone, Peter McCullough, they've never been interviewed. They've never appeared with anyone who's qualified to challenge their perspective. Famously, Brett Weinstein, I had a bit of a run-in with last summer, and he also refused to dialogue. And they don't need to. Like, it used to be able to kind of empty chair someone and be able to, and that used to mean something. Like, you'd say, this person wasn't available. The legacy media would say this person was asked for an interview and they said no, and that would be a kind of a meaningful thing. Now we don't have that. And so we've got an alternative that doesn't interrogate truth because their incentive structure is just to get people on and agree with them, and a mainstream that is quite narrow in who it will interrogate. And so you've got this failing truth-seeking system on both sides. And I think that really became clear during, and particularly with these figures, because I see it all the time on Twitter where people are saying, oh, well, Robert Bone and McCullough, they'll debate anyone, just people. That's not true. Like, they won't. I know for a fact they've been offered behind the scenes to appear with certain people to have that debate, and they won't do it, and yet they're not being called out for it. So the one last thing I'll say is I've tried to, in my coverage of the pandemic on Rebel Wisdom, try and kind of bring in the idea of what is responsible heterodoxy, because I feel like if we're not making a place for responsible heterodoxy and challenging things that I think need to be challenged, like masking kids or school closures and some of the other kind of extreme reactions, if that is effectively demonized in the same way as some of the more extreme conspiratorial claims is demonized, then you end up pushing people towards those more extreme conspiratorial claims. So I think the idea of responsible heterodoxy, of challenging, and I'll say, I think Zubin has done a fantastic job with that during the pandemic. And I know I'd be interested maybe to open it up just after I finished to Zubin, maybe to talk about, because I know that you went on a bit of a journey over the pandemic of being quite kind of virulently anti-vaxxers because of experiences that you'd had, to kind of learning to communicate in a different way and maybe validating some of that responsible heterodoxy. And I know that Chris may disagree with you over what is responsible heterodoxy or not. So that might be a fruitful place to begin. And then, yeah, Ben, I've heard your position a little bit. It sounds a little bit closer to Chris's than to Zubin. So yeah, let's open it up. But I think the idea of responsible heterodoxy for me is maybe a place to start.
Yeah, thanks, David. For me, before this thing started, I was very much in the almost militant pro-science camp. People who were against childhood vaccines, to me, were basically morally bankrupt in a way. And I saw it through a palette of moral taste buds. This is care versus harm. This is fairness versus cheating when it comes to childhood vaccines. Even maybe some, authority versus subversion component of that. And it was very much baked into my training. It was baked into a lot of the stuff that I was doing in the communication space. And what I found during the pandemic is it really woke me up to this idea that, actually, what I have been doing here is preaching to the choir, rallying a tribe that already agrees, growing it very strong, getting all the validation on social media from that group because they loved that I was there being militant about this stuff. The pandemic comes and I'm still in that mindset. I'm very much, if the CDC says it, then it's probably correct because I know people at CDC, I know these scientists, I know these doctors, I've worked with a lot of them. And then what I started to realize is that and this was a journey, like you said, and I can't really encapsulate it easily, but I started really waking up to this idea that, hey, actually really good people with different moral taste buds see the world slightly differently. And they're actually in danger of dying because they're not going to get a vaccine or they're going to do something different that could put them at risk because they see the world, they're trying to be good and they're seeing it as doing good, but through a totally different lens. And me militantly doing this thing where I'm trying to shame them is not going to work. And I'm seeing cracks even in the main COVIDian side of this, because that own group is a self-reinforcing echo chamber, and they can't see that telling people that, we need to close schools when that actually disproportionately harms, poor people, people of color, et cetera. They're not seeing that because they're looking at it through the pure lens of care versus harm from the virus. And the communication was so polarizing that then I started to crack open and go, wait, what's going on here? Talking to different people, much more heterodox people that actually were a little extremely heterodox, like say Dr. Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford, who saw the world through an equity distribution of how are we harming people who are vulnerable by our response to COVID. And then realizing, talking to enough people, getting emails and saying, people actually, they want to see different sides of it, but they want their own morality to be understood and where they're coming from. And if you actually can understand that, then you can speak in a way that makes sense. Then you have this epistemic challenge of, well, what is actually the truth of the science, which actually isn't as black and white as you might think. Especially on masking and things like that, because it's actually very difficult to study. People will say, oh, it's a parachute. You don't study a parachute, it just works. But with cloth masking, with Omicron, we're seeing, well, that's actually not true, because Omicron defeats cloth masking. So what other masks does it defeat in public settings where people are using them incorrectly, et cetera? So for me, it was this journey to trying to say, okay, how do we communicate in a way that actually respects how humans actually are, especially in this fragmented sort of information ecology that we currently have. And it's been an ongoing journey and a challenge. And I get it wrong more often than I get it right, probably.
David, shall I offer some thoughts about responsible heterodoxy? Yeah. So I think the things which, some examples that Ben and you and Zubin have laid out about, the statements made about masking early in the pandemic and various reversals or a lack of nuance in public health messaging. I take that point, and I think it's, a lot of people have seen things like that, and it has decreased trust. And I think there's some leeway to grant for that public health messaging, has a cost, like to signal that they need to manage in terms of how much attention they get, and that it won't always be perfect, and that there might be people, you might think that like giving the most nuanced message would be useful, but that it wouldn't work out as we imagine. However, I'm on the side that yes, people should, that the pandemic has showed that people are responsive to nuance when it's granted and when people discuss trade-offs and these kind of things. But I guess one thing I would say is, like, I see a lot of people wanting to hold to account the CDC or the WHO for statements that they've made, or even Zoom calls, right, talking to Taiwanese reporters, but less so when it comes to statements from the heterodox community. And I don't just mean Robert Malone and Peter McCulloch, because I think they really are the far end of the spectrum, and they say a lot of things which people do push back on, but sometimes ignore that they're also promoting things like RFK Jr., right? Or they're promoting HIV/AIDS denialism sources as well. So it's not just that they have some differing opinions about these particular vaccines, but there's a whole ecosystem that they're tied into. But I guess, and Zubin, I'd probably put this to you directly, that there are, I enjoyed listening to your show, and I think I came across it originally when you and Vinay did an episode about ivermectin, and it was very good. You were talking about how there's lots of studies that show effects in vitro, and that they don't pan out, and but you had nuance, and you spoke about the horse pace thing being an own goal, like Ben said. But so I didn't start off with like a negative position, but I did find it increasingly, and I still listen to your show, that while the mainstream gets called out for like reversals and field predictions, there's a much greater reticence to do that with heterodox figures like Vinay or Marty McCarry or Jay Bhattacharya, and they do make statements which are also misleading, like on your show saying that the influenza is maybe more severe than COVID. And the amount of deaths and hospitalizations during the pandemic showed that's not the case, right? Flu with children specifically. I mean, the cases for influenza have dropped to the floor. The last I checked, it was like 1,500 children died in the US over COVID, and in the same period, it's less than 10 with influenza. So stating that, you know, maybe influenza is a more severe illness for young children seems like to be contradicted by the evidence. And similarly, like Jay Bhattacharya saying that posing this equivalence between that vaccinating everyone is just as dangerous as the anti-vax position of like vaccinating no one in a global pandemic, that seems like a very extreme statement. So I guess I would want to say, you know, that I'm for responsible heterodoxy, but I think there has to be, I heard you and Vinay talking recently about the possibility of, you know, audience dynamics and not being captured by, you know, the incentives, and how everybody online gets that, or, you know, gets some influence from their audience. But the heterodox audience, it doesn't have to be, you know, incentives like you're getting called up to the White House for a position in public health. There's just an incentive from attention and from, you know, Patreon donations or whatever the case may be. But I'm not saying people are intentionally grifting. I just mean those dynamics seem, David's talked about them as well, being very strong on the heterodox side. And I think they don't get factored in as enough. So that's a lot of things, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts.
I love it. I mean, honestly, these are the conversations we need to have, because that idea of capture is key across heterodox, orthodox, all of it. And your criticism of the different statements that, say, guests on my show have made, like Bhattacharya, McCary, et cetera, that's all valid. I think it's important, though, you have to look at the area under the curve of what's being said, right? So I've never equated influenza to COVID, but one important thing is in a very severe influenza year, influenza may kill a whole bunch of kids. And it's not as severe now because of all the different things that we've done. And some of that is actually, you know, closing schools is actually quite effective at stopping influenza, because influenza does transmit very powerfully among kids. This idea of recognizing if there are incentives that are affecting what you're saying is actually very important. And it's important in the heterodox space. So like, you know, a Robert Malone or a Brett Weinstein that may say, look, I don't understand. I have nothing to gain from saying this. I'm just trying to say truth. That is so disingenuous, because it means they have not introspected for a second to understand that. Look at the comments. If they, you know, when I did the video saying, hey, this Plandemic movie is total trash, anyone who watches it is an idiot. It was just me being honest about how I felt at that minute. It wasn't great communication. It gets 3 million views, but 60% of the comments are hate. They just despise me. Like that's like the anti-capture, right? But at the same time, hey, that's still a lot of attention. That's still a lot of ad revenue. That's still, so if I made a whole career of just antagonizing people in the heterodox space, you could make a ton of money. So it's possible to get captured in all these different ways. And unless we're able to introspect and see it, or we have an outside person like a Chris who has a podcast, Decoding the Gurus, who actually does it in an entertaining way and says, look, these are all the things that can happen. And sometimes I think you go a little far, but that's okay, because we do too. So it's all like part of the thing. But I think it's important to have that introspection in such a fractured information ecology. I'm not sure enough people have it. I don't have it enough, but I try. But yeah, back to you guys.
Ben, you're muted.
I guess to circle back to responsible heterodoxy, I'd say I think it depends a little bit what that means, right? So, because I think maybe the first distinction to make there is about facts and values. That you know, like the question is, are we talking about sort of like what's a, you know, epistemic, the responsible way to figure out what's true, or are we talking about what to do with that, right, once we figure it out, right? Like, because of course that's never the same question, you know, what like actual like policies that you should propose is never just a function of what you think the facts are. It's also a question of like which values you think you have to weigh against each other in order to, you know, respond to that, you know. So an example I was thinking about, you know, before, you know, but one that I didn't mention earlier is something that I'd regard as a pretty bad own goal by at least many public health experts relatively early in the pandemic, was when the post George Floyd protest started, and there was a letter that was signed by numerous, you know, public health experts saying, as public health experts, we tell you that the public health consequences of racism are so bad that it's, you know, balances out, you know, any sort of increased COVID risk here. And I remember at the time, despite the fact that I still think, you know, I mean, from my perspective as a non-expert, so there's always a question about, you know, how to figure out, you know, who to believe and why and all of that, you know. But I mean, I think I'm somebody who does think that there is a reasonable amount of consensus among people who are experts on enough of this that, you know, that I feel comfortable, you know, endorsing that. I think all else being equal, that's what you should do. And I've never been convinced by the arguments that all else is not equal here. And I even supported the protests, right? Enthusiastically. And I would have had no problem with, you know, with a letter from a bunch of public health experts saying, hey, you know, if you think this is important enough, you know, then you should do this. And many of us think it's important enough and we'll personally do it, but also here are risks to be aware of and blah, 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 right? That would be fine. But sort of treating it as if that were a matter of purely technocratic expertise, rather than a question of balancing values, I think is dangerous. I mean, I think it's misguided. It's just wrong in itself. And I also think it's dangerous because it undermines, it's so transparently political, right? You know, this is something we approve of, so that's fine, right? You know, if you do the same thing, we don't approve of it, you know, that's dangerous. Any sort of idea that, you know, what the public health effects are going to be, you know, as a sort of ripple effect of a movement like that is so hard to track down and, you know, make confident predictions about. It's kind of absurd on its face. So, you know, I think the effect of doing that is to make it look like, you know, you're sort of just political and, you know, and you're not really a trustworthy neutral source. And so that's going to increase public skepticism. I think that's a really bad move. And I do want to say, I mean, something that, you know, Chris said a few minutes ago that is definitely right is that we shouldn't exaggerate the extent to which saying like properly nuanced and accurate things is going to like convince everybody, right? Like, I mean, clearly not, you know, that's, that would be too much to hope for. But I guess I do still worry about the idea that you're losing even people that you don't have to lose by saying things that, because of the lack of nuance, people who are paying attention can tell, no, wait a second, that's not quite right, is it? Right? You know, you happen to have just the right piece of information, so you know that what you're being told isn't right. And I guess, you know, okay, so even though my position is that I think there's much more room for, you know, responsible heterodoxy, if you want to call it that, or just like reasonable disagreement on value questions than fact questions about COVID, you know, on questions about, okay, given that we know that this is the risk, right? Is such and such worth it? Is that worth it? Is this other thing worth it? You know, like that. I think even on the fact issue, I do really agree a lot with what David said about the sort of futility at this point of the empty chair strategy, right? You know, that just sort of saying like, oh, we're using our authority to just decide that, you know, that this person, you know, this person's ideas aren't going to be entertained, and that's going to stop the ideas from being spread. I mean, I just think like at this point, you know, how's that going, right? Like that's just not an effective strategy. I think maybe at one time it was, but I don't think it is a particularly effective strategy right now. I think that the effect of it, and I also have similar worries about like online censorship, that, you know, somebody thinks they're out to suppress the truth and they say so, and their tweet is deleted and their account is banned. You know, that does tend to offer some superficial plausibility to their entirely inaccurate view. which I don't find helpful. And I think the idea that that's going to mean that people just aren't going to be exposed to the conspiracy theories in the first place, and therefore won't believe them. I just think at this point, whatever you want to say about that as a matter of principle is a pragmatic issue. It's just a losing strategy. So I do think, I mean, I have personally made the decision not to, really, as far as at all possible, debate conspiracy theorists about the medical details, but not because I don't think somebody should, just because I don't think I'm particularly well equipped to. Right? I think that my knowledge of the details is too superficial. And so the only thing I can really do is sort of have a meta argument about how you should figure out who to trust. But I think that the sort of no platforming strategy has kind of been a failure. And people who really are public health experts, I mean, as unpleasant as the task might be, I think that there really is a case, for spending a lot more time getting into it with these people about the details. And if indeed some of prominent conspiracy theorists have refused invitations to do so, then I think that the better strategy would be to play that up as much as possible, to sort of, at least shift the narrative and say that, hey, they're the ones who are unwilling to expose their ideas to scrutiny, et cetera, which I think has the potential to be useful in a way that just sort of ignoring the views and hoping they go away at this point really doesn't.
Could I just offer one quick thought before we get off the topic of values, in case it becomes irrelevant? It probably won't, but the point you make, Ben, about that the not just the choices that are made in public health, but that it's not just technocratic, in that a lot of it will depend on values and what you emphasize, personal freedom versus public health or these kind of trade-offs. Those are always very real, and I think have to be factored into discussions. But I also think a lot of the research about anti-vaccine communities and conspiracy theories show that it isn't that people that they're missing access to more nuanced information that would persuade them of otherwise, right? It's that they actually have a very different epistemic and value system, which includes things like fundamental distrust of authorities, right? And I'm not saying that authorities can do nothing that can help promote that distrust, but that looking at it from the point of view of, well, if we had given nuanced information, that we would have seen like a very different response. I don't think so, because I think that a lot of people's priors were already set before whatever Fauci statement they saw on Twitter. And I also would want to emphasize that a lot of the conversations that I see, they seem to neglect the things like, we have, worldwide, it's been really impressive how many billions of people are vaccinated now. But in the US, where you and Ben and Zubin live, I think, it's like, 67% of the population that are vaccinated, a little bit higher, 70 over
70s, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. But there's a free vaccine available, right, in the middle of a pandemic, and it's a very safe vaccine. And when you talk about like children, the vaccination rate is very low, right? As even with the emergency use authorization. So whenever I see the discussion, it sometimes seems like people are talking as if vaccination is incredibly high. Children are getting vaccinated everywhere. There's mandates instituted and it's been forced, and that's not the situation in the vast majority of countries. And I kind of worry that sometimes the emphasis is on a situation which doesn't actually exist, where there is no community where there's a very strong like anti-vaccine sentiment, or there's no general resistance to policies or a lack of vaccination. And I kind of think that if you're taking those facts into account, like that, it means the emphasis, say, focusing 20 articles on childhood myocarditis, the cost benefit there to me seems to be something that is also worth considering or engaging with. That, you know, the message that that's giving out is that there's a very serious health issue with the vaccines. And then you have the kind of more conspiracy fringe. And I know, Zubin, I've seen you be very annoyed about this. That implies that doctors don't care about patients. They just care about making money from getting COVID cases. And they'll even classify gunshot wounds as COVID cases, right? And painting the whole medical institution in that light. So I kind of worry sometimes that by focusing on the nuance, that the big picture, where there's actually a lot of agreement between mainstream heterodox, mainstream people who are more, you know, pro-establishment or whatever way you want to position it, and that gets lost in kind of pandering to the fringes, which are a lot more extreme, and that actually people don't agree en masse with their point, that there is a lot more convergence around, you know, like the general benefits to vaccination for the vast majority of people. And yeah, I'm curious what anybody else in the panel thinks, or if that's just my emphasis because, you know, I spend a lot of time looking at conspiracy communities and the fringes, and they seem to have a lot more influence than is given credit.
Just really quickly, I looked it up. It's I think you're both right that 66% of people are fully vaccinated in the United States. It's like 77 who've had at least one dose.
That's right. So actually what Chris is bringing up is actually very relevant, which is if we're in the heterodox space, let's say we're challenging an orthodox idea that, you know, every single child should get vaccinated with 2 doses, 3 doses with the booster. And you're saying, well, but wait, there is this potential side effect of myocarditis in a small number of cases, and they do get hospitalized, but they generally get better. To speak of that in a nuanced way and say, yeah, so maybe if a kid got naturally infected, maybe they only need 1 dose. Maybe if they're a boy, they can get away with 1 dose. Those kind of conversations are the conversations that ought to be had. And that's the kind of nuance I think that is not necessarily damaging to the general public health outcome you want, because there is that dichotomy in public health. Like, you get rid of the nuance and just say this, because that way the most people will do that and you'll get a net benefit, right? And then some people will fall through the cracks, but that's public health versus, say, scientific debate, where we go, well, there is this, like, you know, and I've said on my show, if I could wave a magic wand and have every single eligible person vaccinated fully, I would do it, because I think the net harm from that would be less than the benefit that would protect people. But we do, as Ben is saying, there's the values component. It's not just the science. There's also individual values that have a liberty versus oppression moral flavor to it, and also that autonomy versus communion flavor. Like, what are we doing for others? What are we doing for ourselves? What's our values? What's the role of community, the diminishing role of the community? And so my feeling has always been, be as honest and clear about it as you can, trying not to fall in the traps you're talking about, Chris, where it can happen with certain guests. They can really push that one piece a little hard, but trying to say, okay, here's all the thing. If it were my family, if it were my kid, this is what I would do. But I respect your decision if you decide not to do it, but here's what you need to know about that. And if part of that action is hurting other people, you should know that what you're doing might actually harm others. With vaccines, that's less and less clear with Omicron and so on. But at one point, that was our concern.
Is it worth mentioning as well, Zubin, because I know that you have individually dialogued with quite a lot of people who decided to get vaccinated after speaking to you. So it's kind of that the ability to communicate in a nuanced way, I think, does persuade people on an individual level as well.
I think this then gets to that question of, like, how do you persuade people? And honestly, if I'm being completely transparent, that's often in the back of my mind. That's my capture, is like, I kind of have a sense of what the net good is. So how do I persuade people without, but while respecting their stance? And with us, what we found is there are a lot of people who were on the fence about vaccines who say, well, we were persuaded because you weren't an absolutist, but you did say quite clearly, well, if it were your family, you would do this, but you also pointed out the downsides without really completely harping on them. But sometimes I'll lose some of those people if I go very hard on a McCullough or a Malone, because I want to go hard on them, because some of the things they're saying are so obviously out in the conspiracy, right? You just off, and nobody's holding them accountable in that way. You know, you'll see it on Twitter and stuff, but again, nobody's doing a direct debate with them because they won't do it. So, you know, it becomes a little complicated.
I've got a something that might work as a pushback, and I'd be interested to hear what Ben. I've heard you talk about, you know, being in general of like platforming and free speech, and I think David, you made the argument that people aren't. If the mainstream just tries to like close down and not address Malone or McCulloch, it can very much feed the thing that these are, you know, brave truth tellers being suppressed by the mainstream. And I will say that, you know, obviously our podcast, for example, spent multiple hours on them, and I know that you, David, have produced article, also Zubin as well. You did a response to Malone and McCulloch, and David's article. So I think all of us are not people that are ignoring their output. But I think of the example of, you know, Peter Duisberg and the HIV/AIDS denialism, which you could present as like a heterodox hypothesis. It was a scientific suggestion, right? And it was on the fringe. But that and that is another case, by the way, Ben, where Joe platformed him like back before he had such a massive audience. But you know, a similar thing that didn't come up that much, I think, in the current debate. But in any case, Peter Duisberg and other people who have questioned the heterodox, or the around the heterodox is the wrong word, the orthodox around HIV and AIDS, that went on when it became influential in the South African government, when a minister became interested in that, public health minister. And then I believe antiretroviral drugs were at one point kind of stopped. And it's calculated that it resulted in like a huge amount of actual harm and deaths, right? And I think in the same respect, things like Holocaust denial, it's a heterodox position, but there are very few people arguing that we need to have these people in the debate in order to, you know, on the mainstream. So I wonder, in these cases where there seems to be like potential for serious harm, and also or positions which are now considered, you know, so fringe that like we shouldn't be platforming a 50-50 per, giving the impression that like the Holocaust revisionism side and the mainstream are, you know, different opposite sides of an ongoing debate. So I wonder what any of you think about the potential for creating that scenario. You know, if you have a Malone and then the next week you have a mainstream vaccine position, that you're creating that false equivalence and potentially leading to harm by doing so.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of why I was framing what I said earlier as a strategic issue, right? Because even though I think that if we're talking about like laws like the ones that exist censored Holocaust denial in some countries, or even like you know, content moderation rules on platforms, then I think if we're going to ask those questions, there are also more principled arguments you can make there. But putting aside the principled arguments for a moment and just focusing on it as a strategic issue like I did earlier, I think, you know, I don't think it's controversial that some of these views can cause great harm, or at least not controversial in this panel. I think the question is, what's the realistic way of trying to minimize that harm, right? And so I would say that one thing to think about there is just like, sure, if you know, if right now Holocaust denial is incredibly marginal, is there like a real, you know, fortunately, is there a reasonable strategic argument for not like shining a spotlight on it by engaging with it? I'd say yeah. But if Holocaust denial, or to make the analogy more complete, you know, some degree of Holocaust denial, right? You know, people saying, you know, well, I'm not denying that there were anybody who was killed, but, you know, I think that the establishment has really exaggerated this, you know, like if some degree of Holocaust denial were as popular as some degree of COVID conspiracism is in the United States right now, then I think that would be a misguided strategy, just kind of trying to ignore it and sort of hope that just not giving it the legitimacy of engaging with it, will make it go away. I think that if you had, say, I don't know, what the the numbers would have to be, but I mean, if there was like a large percentage of the public who took that seriously, then I think at a certain point, you actually would have to engage with people who, with people who thought that. And I mean, I think this goes for both the, I mean, on both ends of the fact value distinction. Like, I wouldn't, I probably wouldn't do a debate with somebody right now who thought that we should re-legalize slavery. But I'm glad that Abraham Lincoln debated Douglas. I don't think it would have been wise of him to, to pass on the opportunity to do so.
So I think Ben and Chris, this feels to me like a question of what's responsible orthodoxy, right? Like, what is the mainstream response? The Duisburg question is a fascinating one because I was there at Berkeley when he was a professor, and of course he's tenured, so he doesn't get canceled for proposing a very heterodox position. And at the time, there were compelling pieces in his argument early on that, oh, this is something that we should actually, the orthodoxy should answer and explore. If HIV doesn't fulfill Koch's postulates as a causative agent in AIDS, then let's explain that. And so I think that's important. Say, okay, let's answer the question. Then what often happens, and I think Chris can probably understand this better as he studies this, is something happens in that heterodox mind that proposed this thing. There's an egoic identification with the proposal. There's going down this thing where it solidifies, you build walls. And I think a good example of that might be people, the ivermectin crowd. So you start with a proposal, hey, this is some interesting early observational data. And then everything starts getting identified with this position. Like, oh, wait, no, I have this special knowledge now that could solve the pandemic. And I'm getting people listening to me saying, oh, I took ivermectin and I'm cured. And the next thing you know, that person's thing is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And now the delusion is self-manifesting and self-reinforcing. And now it becomes very hard to battle. So when it gets to the Ben threshold of like, okay, now it's no longer just a little, Holocaust denial light. It's like something big. Then it becomes difficult to attack. So the question is, what's the role for responsible orthodoxy? And in my opinion, I think you have to engage with an idea that has even a little plausibility when it's starting to grip. And especially in a time of a pandemic, like if you ignore a McCullough Malone, which would have been my stance on the false equivalency, back pre-COVID, I'd have been like, don't give these guys a platform. I mean, we know it's, not scientifically accurate. Why would we want to even introduce doubt? But now it's like, there's no Walter Cronkite, as Ben was saying, there's no single source of truth. So people are going to get their fragmented knowledge somewhere, and then it's going to grow and it's going to self-reinforce with their own ideological belief. Because again, these things stratify by political belief. Republicans are more likely to minimize COVID and maximize danger of vaccines, and Democrats are the opposite. So that's really fascinating. Okay, well, we know there's probably a truth somewhere. It may be epistemically hard to figure out, but we better understand what's going on there if we're going to try to find a net positive in outcomes. So
I think we're going to, in a minute, transition to a couple of questions, but I just want to speak to the false equivalence point because it's one I've thought about a lot. And I think for me, the question, because it's not just the false equivalence, it's also, like you say, that there's a question of at what point does an idea get enough traction that it needs to be addressed. There's also the question of who does the addressing, because if the CDC puts out a kind of debunking of McCullough or Malone, that's not going to touch anyone who was persuaded by them in the first place. So the question for me comes down to who has the obligation to host someone who would rebut Malone. Like for me, that comes down to this is the decentralization of like the ethical obligations are on every single content creator in a way. So who has the obligation to host someone who can oppose someone like Malone or McCullough? For me, it's Brett Weinstein and Joe Rogan. Like Joe Rogan and Brett, and the thing I'm absolutely fed up with, and I think like the Joe Rogan thing was fascinating that happened in about January or February, where it was an explosion of everything that happened the summer before with Brett, and because they were the same figures in a lot of ways. And for me, Joe Rogan is now by far the most influential media personality in the world. And it's just not enough to keep just bringing people on and allowing them to spout all over him. I just think that it's time for the heterodox space to grow up. And I said that the idea of kind of no platforming doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is because there's so many different media platforms. When I used to work for the BBC and Channel 4, we could still say, we asked a minister from the Department of Pensions for a response, and they were not available, and you'd look meaningfully at the camera, and that would actually mean something. It doesn't mean something and hasn't meant something for a long time. But Joe Rogan, if he was to say, I asked Robert Malone to come on and debate this person, and Robert Malone refused, that would have some sting. And so I do think that, there's the entire heterodox space, as I've kind of gone more deeply into this, I just think it needs to grow the fuck up, because it's not enough to just keep throwing shade at the mainstream and not take on, if you're going to take on some of the power of the mainstream, you have to take on some of the responsibility as well. And I think that it's that question of sort of, as Ben, you pointed out, gatekeeping doesn't work anymore. The whole idea of gatekeeping is dead. But I think, yeah, it's time now for people like Rogan. They've got enough money, they've got enough clout, they've got enough brain power behind them. They should be creating valuable alternatives to the legacy media. And one of those, at the very least, would be, for example, Malone up against someone who's qualified to oppose it. Like Malone would probably only want to debate Anthony Fauci and would assume that he was the only person on his level. But that could happen. And I think someone like Joe Rogan would have the clout, and others within the kind of heterodox space would have the clout to create something that would be able to do the job that we've lost through the legacy media.
David, thank you for the image of somebody spouting all over Joe Rogan. That's gonna stick with me now. But one thing, just I mean, that's music to my ears to some extent. But I just want to add that, like, sometimes my position and people in my area gets presented as like that we want nobody to interact with these figures, and that anybody that does is, guilt by association tainted. And I'm not saying there's nobody who takes those positions, right? That you shouldn't be on platforms. Ben, you get criticism every time that you go on platforms with people. So it is a real position. But I want to emphasize that what people like myself, and I think a lot of people are asking for, is not that you never speak to Malone or McCulloch, but that if you do it, and including if you're a Rogan person, that you put some effort and ask critical questions, and you don't ask like half-hearted softball questions, right? We've seen that Rogan can push back when he wants to. He pushed back strongly at Sanjay Gupta, right? And his pushback at Malone is sort of like, do you really think they would do that? Right? That's the extent it gets to. And in earlier Rogan, when he called out like Stefan Molyneux, for example, he played some video of Molyneux saying quite extreme misogynistic things, and Molyneux was back-footed, right? And it didn't break down the conversation, but it showed that Joe was not a rube, and like it damaged, I think, Molyneux's reputation while giving him a platform. So like the critical questioning thing seems key to me. And I think that if you're going to put two people like head to head in the way that you're discussing, David, there does have to be consideration that there are a lot of people who are in the mainstream that might have the science on the side, who are not well equipped to deal with conspiracy theorists in a debate format. I think Sanjay Gupta's response to Joe, for example, was largely in that vein, that he just wasn't aware of the talking points or how to respond to them, and did a bad job. But he probably didn't realize that he was going to be debating like Joe on those points. So I guess I'm just seconding your call for responsible heterodoxy and saying that, this seems like an area where there is the possibility and the need for people who are willing to disregard a little bit of the civility porn, which is prevalent in the heterodox sphere, be a bit more disagreeable. And especially if your whole brand is that you're willing to say what people won't say, and you're willing to, make points to people, then then do it. Not just to the people that everyone is fine to beat up on in the heterodox sphere, right? Like the CDC and the WHO are the villains, but your audience will not react well if you go hard on Malone, and that should tell you something.
So I'd like to tag Peter back in. Does anyone want to quickly wrap up with to respond to any of that, or shall I tag Peter in? Okay, I think Peter's getting tagged in. Oh, Ben, I think you're speaking, but you.
Oh no, I was just going to say. I find Joe Rogan extremely likable, but I have a lot of issues with his guest list. He should certainly he should certainly have, and I mean, I think he pushes back against things that he disagrees with, right? That's is the real thing, or he disagrees with beyond a certain threshold. And there are things that I think he's right about, and there are things that I think he's wrong about. But he has always had a certain predilection towards conspiracy theories. I'm old enough that I watched news radio in the late 90s, and the character that he played on there, the handyman named Joe, would say things about like Area 52, and the other character would say, "Oh, you mean Area 51?" He's like, No, that's what they want you to think, right? It's Area 52, which I assume was a sort of playful inside joke even back then. So I think that even if he does do things like, he is willing to be a little disagreeable with, Molyneux or, Dave Rubin or Candace Owens, people he has, I think, usefully pushed back on at various points, right? He's not going to push back against on this stuff because I don't think these are issues where his instincts are as good. That said, I do think that he has, brought up to some legitimate experts with what I would regard as largely correct views about all of this stuff, the idea that they should do debates with some of these people and have them say no, which, again, I don't think any individual necessarily has a moral obligation to, but I do think it's a problem that more people with that expertise are unwilling to, for all the reasons we've been talking about.
Awesome. So I'm going to jump back in. Awesome stuff, gentlemen. A lot of good threads opened up, and we have about 15 minutes left, so we probably have time for one question. And let there be light in the Stoa. Feel free to turn on your camera. And we have Stephanie from the Center for Humane Technology with us. So Stephanie, if you would like to ask your question.
Oh, I can't believe I got the only question. I didn't know. I feel so honored, and also, wow. And sorry to everyone else who asked questions. Maybe we need a part two. Yeah, thank you, Peter. Thank you for, as always, bringing an amazing crew together. My question is in the spirit of being the change, or as David so articulately put it, of the heterodox space growing the fuck up, which requires cleaning up and waking up and all that other ways of getting up there. The question is just what would the responsible heterodoxy conversation on COVID look like? Like, what would be your dream come true? Basically, conversation, like between who, on what show, what format? Is it an anti-debate? What is it that we would love to see? And then when we're done here, we can go make that happen. Over to the panelists.
Man, that's a tough one. It's almost an area under the curve of different conversations you'd want to see. I mean, I'm a little biased, but I'd love to see somebody like Dr. David Katz, who's a very thoughtful, nuanced person who's very much into the nutrition space, Yale doc. He's been on my show, but he is as sort of liberal tribe as you can get, but has very sort of heterodox opinions on how we've managed pandemic. I'd love to see him talk with, say, Anthony Fauci, or somebody like Dr. Ashish Jha, who's now on Biden's committee with COVID, and have a real conversation about the marriage of science and sense. Like, what is it that is true, and what is it that it actually means in terms of common sense and policies that we care about as a people, that tension between autonomy and community and all the things you talk about. So that would be my vote.
If anyone wants to respond, feel free to just jump in.
I was just going to say, yeah, go for it, Chris.
Go, David.
No, I was just going to say, Stephanie, you mentioned anti-debate. So anti-debate and kind of dialogos is something we talk about a lot, of conversations that can take us somewhere new and can be entered into in a sense of kind of exploration. That doesn't really work if there's an element of bad faith in the conversation. And I've kind of been very aware of that with the COVID conversation, because there are, whether that's that you're established with a certain perspective because of audience reasons, or whether that's because you have other kind of motivations that lead you to a certain perspective, there was an awful lot of that going on. And honestly, my experience was that there was a psychological attractor, kind of quite dark psychological attractors for some of the places that were staked out in the kind of landscape. And those seem to be the primary alignment rather than the actual substance, because the substance would change all the time. There was a kind of psychological alignment around anything that the mainstream says is wrong. And it went from vaccines to ivermectin to, like, you could predict what someone was going to say based on their pre-existing alliances. And that was, that was really, I'd be interested to see whether there's anyone who's put together a kind of psychological mapping of different argument spaces and different positions in the kind of mimetic landscape. Because it's definitely a factor that, it's another thing I've talked about quite a bit, is that this idea of kind of the ad hominem, we have to bring in the hominem in some way, like in some conscious way, because we're operating through platforms that are weaponizing our psychological flaws against us. It's never been more important to bring in the psychological dimension. And yet, for a lot of people, like, ad hominem or anything that is not sort of strictly on the factual is ruled off limits, which means that you can't really have a conversation about the full spectrum of what's going on. I know Chris has talked about this quite a lot in their podcast, and it's a dangerous territory, because also you can invalidate someone completely by just pointing to their motivations, and it's essentially unfalsifiable. But I think we do need a more sophisticated conversation about the deeper dimensions, or the deeper kind of psychological drivers of a lot of this stuff, because that was the primary driver, as far as I could see, of some of the more extreme positions.
Yeah, and I think it's a difficult question to answer, because there's so many topics and so many things, like how to have what kind of discussion you'd like to see about geopolitics or so on. And I'm an academic, so I have like my very niche interests as well. So I probably don't have as good answer as Zubin or anyone else, but I would say that and this is not just pandering because he's here, but I think I would like, on the issue of like COVID, to see a kind of conversation between somebody like Zubin, who occupies what I would regard as the more reasonable heterodox position, and a critic like say someone, Jonathan Howard from Science-Based Medicine, who's been quite harshly critical about Vinay and Zubin. But I think that in a conversation that there would be a clear a larger part of this of agreement. And I think it would be valuable, like I kind of intimated earlier, to highlight the parts where there is a lot of overlap, and where the fringe positions are fringe within heterodox and orthodox spheres. That would be some conversations that I think that could be valuable to see. So that's just one example I would like.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if I have anything to add to this. I think that something I've been thinking about all event is something that David said in his opening comments, which made my ears perk up as a socialist, which is that he said that the conversation in the UK is more reasonable because the BBC, as a sort of anchor, for media, is a useful publicly owned institution. But putting aside that fantasy for the United States, I guess. So I just looked it up and remembered what I was thinking of. So I think it was when Osterholm was on Rogan, and he asked him if he'd debate, somebody who, is whatever. He probably used a much nicer term, but, I would think of as a conspiracy theorist. And he said no, because they would be saying so many things that were wrong to, like you have to look stuff up to correct him. He's like, that's okay. We could pause and, look stuff up. And it's like, oh, but it would take like 8 hours. It's like, okay, we could do 8 hours, and I think that's actually, I think it might be a forum. I mean, I think somebody like Ostrom should take him up on that, and then as David said, I mean, if anybody would be in a position to sort of shame somebody into appearing in that, it would be Joe Rogan. And even with his instincts on that issue not being great from my perspective, I think the idea of hosting something might appeal to clearly does appeal to him. He brought up the idea, so I guess my ideal debate would be an 8-hour one on JRE.
And that, just very, very quick, like postscript I would add is that, we are talking about the culture war and we're based, like North American or European, like English speaking debates. But I think it really does help to remember that, the US and the secondary, the UK is not the whole of the world. Like I live in Japan, so it's often very easy to remember this, but like the debates around masks, they don't exist here, right? Or in East Asia in general, because it's normal, and it was normal behavior even before the pandemic for people to wear it when they got sick. People around me are still masked, and people might regard that as a negative thing, but I just want to highlight that it's we sometimes in the culture war, people talk as if that's all there is, right? The US, the UK, and maybe other parts of Europe, but there's a big world out there, and the opinions and public health advice and stuff differs. Like Japan's public health advice has differed from the start of the pandemic. So just that, keeping the kind of our myopic perspectives in view is probably good advice, like whatever the topic.
And one last postscript to that postscript, which is great. It's an important point, is that different countries' responses to the pandemics are very much informed by that mix of science and values, and how the Japanese do it, and the Singaporeans do it, and the South Koreans do it, and the Swedish do it, and the UK does it. It may be quite different than how the US does it. And I think finding afterwards, I think it'd be great to do some kind of postmortem with as much data as we can and go, okay, so of these different value systems, which seem to fare the best ultimately? And it's a tough question to answer scientifically, but we should at least try.
All right, so there's a lot of good questions in the chat, but there are a lot of heavy questions as well, and we only have 4 minutes. So how about we just go around the panel? Any parting thoughts or words you'd like to leave us with? And then this might be too much of an ask, but was there any one personal lesson you took away from the culture war? And just popcorn style, whoever would like to go first.
I guess I'll go, since I started and I tend to ramble, so I'll keep it short. I think the biggest lesson that I got out of the whole thing was that, oh, wow, everybody is coming from a place pretty much where they're trying to do the right thing, and they have their own value system, their own moral matrix, all of that. And, everything Jonathan Haidt has written about it is correct. Everything you've written about the different tribes and all that is correct. And I think it's important to then come from this place of love, which requires what is it Stephanie had mentioned, right? It's waking up, cleaning up, growing up, showing up, all those things, the sort of Wilberian kind of ethos. We need to do that introspectively for ourselves, and then we need to encourage it as a society, which will then bring that balance of autonomy and community back into something that's more feasible. And that's something that has become much more clear to me during the pandemic, when I started very militant in one way, and now I think I'm starting to evolve a little bit in a way where it has really changed how I think and how I communicate.
I don't have a very insightful thought, so I'll just piggyback on Zubin's to say that I think the thing that he emphasized about recognizing that most people are just, they're doing what they think is right, and that they are trying to do the right thing for their kids or for themselves and so on. It's generally right to assume that people's motives are not, that they're nefarious villains, even the people that are strongly promoting and profiting of, like COVID conspiracies or that kind of thing. But so recognizing, people's humanity, I think is really important, and that it can be lost when people get into their, tribal subsets. But at the same time, like sometimes love is harsh, and the best thing that you can sometimes do to people that you respect is to be brutally honest with them about things. So I guess I'm just adding a footnote to say, like, I'm all for love, but I want to keep the the brutal truth and the right to be disagreeable as not something that should be seen as off limit or impolite.
Great.
Ben, do you want to go next, or?
Sure. Sorry, I just got distracted thinking about brutal love. So let me try. I guess I think that, to the greatest extent possible, I think that, there's a balance to be struck between sort of, I think that there are contexts in which obviously disagreeability is very much merited. Like I don't disagree with that at all. But I guess I think the distinction that would maybe matter the most to me there would be sort of between people who are, hardcore ideologues who are not probably personally going to be shaken from their position. So if you're talking to them, you're really trying to talk to people who are listening to them, and people who are just, ordinary people who are trying to figure out what's true, oftentimes with very faulty, sort of personal metrics for figuring out what's true. And I think that, with people in that second category, which is the vast majority of people who might think things about this I disagree with. I mean, I think the more you sort of let this become a culture war issue, the harder it's going to be, right? I wouldn't recommend calling people COVIDiots, for example, right? That's that I think that the more that the more that you can sort of seem like a reasonable and approachable person, who also maybe has some stuff to say, yeah, that's why I don't really buy this. I think that, I do think there's a consensus of medical experts, whatever, I think that you're probably better off, right? So, I mean, I tend, I think of the late Michael Brooks's comment about being kind to people and ruthless with systems and kind to people, and I think that there's a lot that could be said about this that sort of goes beyond the topic of this panel. Thinking about, for example, the fact that a statistically significant percentage of unvaccinated people in the United States list as one of their reasons that they're worried about getting time off work if they have side effects. Which is something that I think can get lost if we spend all of our time thinking about the sort of hardest core conspiracy theorists. But yeah, I think that there are degrees of brutality and the lack thereof that love can be combined with. And I think with your brother-in-law who doesn't wear a mask in places where you would, and might have some dubious ideas about how to figure out what's true, I would recommend a relatively low degree.
So yeah, just something that Ben said sparked a thought in me, which is another piece that I think leads to a sense of the compassion that Zubin was maybe talking about, is how much do people genuinely choose their own information diet, and how much is it the environment they grow up in, how much is it sort of because the image on the kind of the vaccine skeptical side is that, oh, it's just all of the kind of consensus sheep people who are taking the vaccine, and we're the free thinkers who don't. It's well, then why are you all clustered together in groups of people who aren't taking the vaccine? Everyone is influenced by their environment, and how much personal agency do people have over that? Like I think a certain amount of compassion, realizing like we don't necessarily choose our information environment, we don't necessarily choose who we trust, and if some of those trusted sources go south under the impact of the fragmentation of the pandemic, then I think a little bit of compassion that this is something that not everyone is choosing, not everyone has absolute agency over, I think helps frame that as well. So to answer the question about what happens, I really like the idea that we should have some kind of process of reviewing, like what were the stress fractures, what were the problems that this pandemic showed up, how could we come up with better truth-seeking mechanisms? If this was a kind of near-death experience for many different aspects of the information ecology, is there a way of strengthening it in a more mature way? That kind of process, I think, would go a long way to finding the gold in what was a really kind of difficult experience for a lot of people.
All right, so we'll close here. Zubin, Chris, Ben, David, thank you so much for coming to Stoa. Everyone, thank you for coming out today. And those watching or here, if you want to check out more events of the Stoa, we have such philosophical, serious events like Hate is the New Sex and Pussy Magic coming up. So you can enjoy that. Yeah, so everyone, thank you so much for coming to the Stoa today.